I don't know if y'all are aware, but we are all in for such a treat. So, to start with, in January 2022, CHLP filed two complaints with the DOJ, one in Tennessee and one in Ohio, asking them to investigate all of the HIV criminal statutes as violations of the ADA. On December 1st of 2023, yes, 3 months ago, the DOJ came back in Tennessee and found that their aggravated prostitution statute does in fact violate the ADA. Now, I don't want to go into too much detail, but I will ask you to check out our webinar in December, which can be found on CHLP's page, YouTube page. But as far as for information, I want to give a brief summary of what was talked about in that 12-page findings document. As was mentioned, the Department of Justice found that Tennessee's aggravated prostitution statute violates the ADA. And the reason why is it holds people living with HIV to a different standard than someone not living with HIV who's arrested under the same crime of alleged sex work. And what's really important in this letter is the DOJ made a number of recommendations. And the first one is that the state of Tennessee, including the prosecutors, stop enforcing this law. That means stop arresting people. It means the prosecutors stop charging, and it means that the state has to get rid of this law. It also said that the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation, which is where people are forced to register as a sex offender for the rest of their lives, stop having that as a requirement. It also said to remove people essentially off of the registry. And last, it said to pay back damages, like for all of the folks that had to register and pay fines. Again, this is an overview. It's a couple of panelists who can talk more about that, but that's why we're here, as far as to talk about that and how advocates are applying that in their work, and to learn about a groundbreaking case, OutMemphis versus Lee, which really ties in. So again, I'm the moderator. I'm just here to introduce our panelists. So to start, as goes the South, as goes the nation. It's no surprise to me that this comes out of Tennessee. So we're going to start with the co-chair of the Tennessee HIV Modernization Coalition, DeMarcus. Can you please talk briefly about the work of the THMC and the impact of the DOJ findings on the work that y'all are doing?
Sure, no problem. And thank you so much, Mandisa, for having me. Thank you, everybody at the Center for HIV Law and Policy, for having me as well. So just a little bit about the THMC. So THMC was created around 2016. We saw the need to address all the outdated HIV laws that are currently in effect here in Tennessee. And so from there, we gathered so many people from across all disciplines. So from those living with HIV, those individuals who are directly have been impacted by these laws, individuals who are service providers, legal experts, and some are several community partners, and as well as our national organizations as well, to help us with this particular work. And so from that, as we kind of got together, organized and reorganized in some instances, we wanted to really consider these things from a racial, social justice, and as well as a gender justice lens as well, which we know that these particular laws directly impact though individuals of color. And speaking for myself as an individual living with HIV and as well as Mrs. Within Shelby County, we know that a lot of these, well, I want to inform you all that a lot of these laws affect a lot of the findings or the individuals that were impacted by this particular law. 90% of those came from Shelby County. And so that's alarming for me as a resident of Shelby County, and as well as an individual living with HIV, and as well as an individual that is friends, colleagues, and some of my peers and family who are a part of this community affected and impacted by these laws. And so for us, it's super important for us to get behind the cause. And so for us, it required us to get together and think more strategically, get more people around the table and have the conversations, because a lot of these times, these conversations happen in silos. So the first time I ever heard of HIV criminalization laws was from one of my inner groups of friends that were actually going through a case at that particular time. And so from there, it just required us to really just be on the forefront of those outdated and egregious laws. And so for us, the DOJ finding just more so confirmed what we knew, that these particular laws are harmful, they are unjust, and they just do not belong in where we're trying to move forward as far as decriminalizing HIV. And so for us, it just wanted us to continue to show up and think of the different ways in which it impacts us. And so that includes making sure that individuals do not have to register on the sex offender list, and making sure that these laws are repealed, making sure that criminal exposure is a thing of the past. And so that a lot of these things kind of inform us, and just making sure that our communities continue to be safe, whole, and unimpacted by these laws. And so I will stop there.
Thank you, DeMarcus. I'm sure later folks are going to ask some questions about like any particular bills. So if you want to answer that now, or if you want to come back to
Most
that.
definitely can answer that. And so right now, as a coalition, we're following 5 bills. These particular bills, one, we're working towards repealing aggravated prostitution. 2, we're working to eliminate criminal exposure. And we're also following laws right now that currently will enhance certain different statutes for individuals who are living with HIV. One of those, if the individual was raped by an individual and is found out that they had HIV, it would enhance that particular what I'm trying to say, crime. I'm sorry. And so many other things. And we have some laws, some bills that are going through that impact individuals who were victims of sex trafficking. And so that will allow them, the individuals, to be removed from that particular list, and as well as the ways for individuals who are currently on the list to come off that list as well. So there are many things we are following, some way more closely, because again, it enhances those laws that are currently affecting us trifold. And so we really just have to be abreast of them. But right now we have 5 that we're following. So it's definitely a busy season for us. We just want to make sure that we are abreast and well informed about everything that's going on. So those are the things that we are following as a coalition right now.
Thank you so much.
No problem.
Many folks may not be aware that about 6 or 7 weeks prior to the DOJ findings letter on December 1st, that a federal lawsuit was actually filed in the Western District of Tennessee. As one of the attorneys, I want to introduce folks to Alexi Agathocleus. Can you speak about the lawsuit, namely how this lawsuit was actually grounded in a community, and what is its connection to the DOJ findings, if at all?
Great, thanks, Mandisa. We could pull up my slides, that would be great. So I'm Lexi Gethicleus, he, him, his pronouns, and I work at the National ACLU. I want to just start out by thanking Mandisa and CHLP for convening us here today and for all their incredible leadership on these issues. It's a real honor to be on this panel with these advocates. So I'm going to try to do a couple of things today. I want to just provide everyone with an overview of OutMemphis versus Lee. That's the civil rights lawsuit challenging Tennessee's aggravated prostitution statute and the related sex offender registration requirements that Mandisa just mentioned. And also in the process, hopefully like demystify that legal process a little bit, point towards how it's connected to the efforts DeMarcus just described, and also hopefully point out ways in which similar HIV criminalization laws might be challenged. So why don't we move to the next slide? So what is this case? OutMemphis versus Lee is a first of its kind challenge to an HIV criminalization law as a violation of the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, as well as the Rehabilitation Act, which is the ADA's predecessor. Case also brings claims under the US Constitution. And the sort of goal of the case is to strike down Tennessee's discriminatory, irrational, and cruel aggravated prostitution law and the related sex offender registration requirements. So quick recap about the statute. So in Tennessee, an individual who is convicted under the generic prostitution statute faces a small fine and jail time. But as Mandisa was explaining, Tennessee has also chosen to criminalize what it calls aggravated prostitution, which is identical to the prostitution statute. These are the terms of the statutes, not my words. But it has one key additional element, knowledge that one is living with HIV. So unlike prostitution, aggravated prostitution is a felony for which people have spent years in prison, and it requires lifetime registration as a so-called violent sex offender. And importantly, the law completely ignores underlying circumstances. So it does not require intent to transmit HIV. It does not require actual HIV transmission. Consent isn't a defense. The use of mitigation that entirely eliminates the risk of HIV transmission, such as condoms or ART or PrEP, is not a defense. And the statute applies even when the alleged sexual activity poses no risk of HIV transmission whatsoever. So in other words, this incredibly harsh law is based on stigma, on discrimination, on outdated science. It doesn't protect public safety. It doesn't promote public health. In fact, it undermines both by disincentivizing knowing your HIV status at all. Okay, let's move to the next slide. So how did this come about? This is sort of what Mandisa was just asking about. So this litigation was really developed to complement the work led by impacted individuals in Tennessee, by local movement leaders, such as DeMarcus and his colleagues at the coalition, and local, state, and national organizations working on HIV criminalization. So we sort of first heard of the issue by word of mouth, but the issue really got crystallized for us when the Williams Institute at ACLU, and shout out to some attendees from the Williams Institute with us tonight, published a report in 2022 about how this law was being enforced and who it was impacting, showing perhaps predictably that its burden was being felt most by Black, cis, and trans women. And so after sort of digesting that research, we connected with CHLP, who obviously, well known to everyone, have been working to dismantle HIV criminalization laws for years. And they introduced us to the Tennessee HIV Modernization Coalition, which has been advocating to dismantle, as you just heard, Tennessee's HIV criminalization laws through legislative reform and other strategies. And our approach to this case is really driven by the view that if we're going to dismantle this law, we need to use sustained, integrated strategies that are designed to build lasting change. So it's been really important to us that any litigation we were going to file would complement and support and build on these community-led goals and strategies, including the visionary work being done by DeMarcus and his co-chairs at the coalition. So the legal team working on this case is comprised of the ACLU, the ACLU of Tennessee, and also the Transgender Law Center. As Mandisa just mentioned, it was filed on October 24th, 2024 in the Western District of Tennessee. That's a federal trial court that hears federal claims in the part of Tennessee that includes Shelby County. Okay, next slide. So who do we represent in this lawsuit? So we have 5 clients. 4 of them are individuals who have been convicted of aggravated prostitution and have been forced to register as sex offenders or violent sex offenders as a result. 3 of the 4 plaintiffs have been granted pseudonymity in this case. What that means is that they're identified in all filings and publicly as Jane Doe. And that's in order to protect their privacy. So we cannot share their names. 4th individual plaintiff is Michelle Anderson, incredible advocate who has decided to use her name in this litigation and has spoken about the impacts of this law on her, really powerful. And then finally, our 5th client is OutMemphis, which is an incredible nonprofit organization that provides the LGBTQ+ community, including people convicted of aggravated prostitution, with support around housing, employment, healthcare, and other needs. So OutMemphis is really on the front lines trying to mitigate the harms that this law is causing. And so they really bring an important voice and perspective to this litigation too. Okay, next slide. Okay, who have we sued? So we have sued the governor of Tennessee, Bill Lee, the attorney general, Jonathan Spermedi, the director of the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation, David Roush, and the commissioner of the Tennessee Department of Corrections, Frank Strada. So these are all government officials who are responsible for the administration and enforcement of Tennessee laws and have the power to remedy the violations that we've alleged. Next slide. So what are our claims? So I'm going to try to cover a lot of ground quickly now and wrap up soon. So our claims in the case are that both the aggravated prostitution statute and the registry requirements, first and foremost, violate the ADA and its predecessor, the Rehabilitation Act. And this is our claim in a nutshell. So HIV has been recognized as a disability under the ADA for a long time, and the ADA prohibits discrimination based on a disability. And so by singling out people living with HIV for uniquely harsher punishment, the aggravated prostitution statute blatantly discriminates. It does so on its face. So it explicitly violates the letter of the ADA. But importantly, it also violates the spirit of the ADA, because the ADA is really intended to address discrimination against people living with disabilities in critical areas like employment and housing. And yet people convicted of aggravated prostitution and forced to register are effectively barred from many employment opportunities, housing options, public space, family and community life. So for example, they're forbidden from working or living or even spending short amounts of time within 1,000 feet of a school, a playground, a park, or an area where children gather. What that means is in large cities like Memphis, finding work and housing outside these vast and ever-changing exclusion zones is nearly impossible. So we're really trying to use the litigation to shine a light on those harms. But in addition, we have alleged a series of constitutional violations as well. So we argue that the aggravated prostitution statute and the registry violate the equal protection and substantive due process clauses of the 14th Amendment. And in a nutshell, our argument is that because those laws single out HIV among many infectious diseases that are just as prevalent, just as transmissible, just as consequential, for uniquely harsh treatment based on stigma, discrimination, and outdated science, they violate the Constitution. So obviously, you know, as is well known to everyone here, there's been a real sea change in both the treatment of HIV, the prevention of its transmission in recent years. And so there are, and in addition, there are, of course, many sexual acts that carry little to no risk of HIV transmission. So given these facts, our arguments under these claims is that it's essentially entirely irrational and just unjustifiable to single out HIV for uniquely harsh punishment in this way. Our next constitutional claim is that these laws violate the 8th Amendment's prohibition on cruel and unusual punishment. Because this law categorically imposes lifetime sex offender registration on people living with HIV based on that disability alone. Now, there's a national consensus against lifetime sex offender registration for similar offenses. We know that most people convicted of aggravated prostitution are engaging in survival sex that poses little to no risk of HIV transmission. As I said, the aggravated prostitution statute does not involve intent to transmit HIV or actual transmission of HIV. So in other words, this punishment just greatly outweighs the severity of the conduct involved. And finally, we've brought an ex post facto clause claim. So what is that? That is a sort of provision in the United States Constitution which prohibits retroactive punishment. In other words, you can't impose a punishment on someone that wasn't available at the time they were convicted of a crime. And here, many of the most onerous registry restrictions, including the prohibition on being around children unsupervised and the exclusion zones that I was describing, were adopted after our clients were convicted of aggravated prostitution, and so they violate this constitutional prohibition. Okay, next slide. Okay, so what are we asking the court to do in this lawsuit? So first, we're asking the court to strike down the aggravated prostitution and stop its enforcement. We're asking that the court order that Tennessee stop placing people convicted of aggravated prostitution on the registry, that they remove everyone convicted of aggravated prostitution from the registry, and that they expunge all registry-related state records, indicating that individual plaintiffs and all others with aggravated prostitution convictions were ever on that registry to begin with. Okay, next slide. So how all does this interact with what the DOJ has done? So Mandisa mentioned that the DOJ issued a findings letter late last year, agreeing that this sort of legal scheme violates the ADA. And ultimately, the United States filed a lawsuit against Tennessee on February 15th, just a couple of weeks ago. They filed it as a related case to OutMemphis v. Lee, and what that means is that the DOJ's lawsuit is being heard in the same court as ours by the same judge. So what that case does is it challenges the aggravated prostitution statute and the registry requirements under the ADA. So I just want to highlight some similarities and some differences. So that ADA claim sort of crosses both cases, but obviously, as I mentioned, OutMemphis also brings a series of constitutional challenges to these laws as well. And then obviously, the way the DOJ files a lawsuit is they represent the United States of America. It's literally, the caption is United States versus Tennessee. We represent a series of individual plaintiffs as well as OutMemphis. Okay, next slide. And I swear I'm almost done. So what happens now? So as I said, we filed in the fall of last year. The state of Tennessee has moved to dismiss our entire case. In other words, they are saying that have not stated proper legal claims, and they've asked the court to throw out our lawsuit. So we are in the process of answering that motion. We'll be filing it in just a couple of weeks. And we expect that the court will hear arguments on those motions, on that motion, and decide it soon after. In the meanwhile, we'll be moving into what's called discovery. So discovery is the part of a lawsuit where the parties have to exchange documents or are allowed to ask each other a series of questions to sort of build up the record to litigate our claim. I have included a case page on this slide for the lawsuit. So that's where you can find out more about the lawsuit and what's going on in it. So the complaint that we filed last year can be found there. And ultimately, our briefing will be found there. So to the extent those documents are useful in your work, please go check them out, download them, and reach out if you have any questions. So that's the case in a nutshell.
Thank you so much. It is really important that people have an overview of what's happening, not just from organizers such as DeMarcus, who are on the ground tirelessly involved in this work, but also how are these lawsuits connected. So thank you for that. So thinking of the Mississippi Delta region, we're going to start in Tennessee, and then we're going to take it down south to its neighbor, Mississippi. Linda, I've always had an affinity as far as the movement work in Mississippi, because after all, it's the Blackest state in the country. It is. So many people aren't aware of the amazing work happening in Mississippi. So please talk about the work that you're leading in Mississippi, and also what this findings letter could mean in your advocacy.
Thank you so much. And thank you to CHLP and your team for inviting me to join this panel. Thank you very much. My name is Linda Dixon. I'm the Health Law Director at the Mississippi Center for Justice. We are a nonprofit public interest law firm. The DOJ letter just serves as a reminder that we really do need to take this very personal, because it affects all of us. It really does. It goes to the very core and fiber of why I'm sure most of us do this work. I'm really excited to be a part of the Mississippi HIV Decriminalization Network. It is a wonderful coalition of individuals, organizations, people living with HIV, and other networks committed to reforming the HIV criminalization statutes in Mississippi. And we've come a long way. We started with a few, and now a mighty few, if you will, but it's great that we've been able to meet consistently on a regular basis, and it's just been great. And when I think about this letter, I think about how it's being added to our toolkit and the things that we have in this movement. We have a website, we have talking points, fact sheets and things of that nature, but this just adds so much greater context to help us. We have great research and issue briefs and reports. The Center for HIV Law and Policy and the Williams Institute just came out with a great report on Mississippi, the enforcement of HIV criminalization in Mississippi, and the Serial Project have been wonderful national partners. So let me add that these partners, national partners, have been a part of the work, whether we were loosely formed in coalition, now we're tightly formed. So we really appreciate the continued support that you all have provided to us. This letter reinforces the need to advocate for policy. I mean, I read it quite a few times, and I'm in awe that somebody could just spell this out the way they have, because this is more than just, and I think DeMarcus said these exact words, this is more than just a public health issue. This is a racial and social justice issue. and it hits on almost every social determinant of health that we could possibly think of and how it is adversely affecting people with arrest, prosecution, and then even folks who it may deter from getting tested and what that really means from a public health standpoint. You know, it underscores the need for reform to ensure that laws are based on current scientific knowledge. I really appreciated having the CDC mentioned in this. If you haven't read it, it's on page 5, if you haven't read the letter. But the CDC has called for states to repeal or update outdated laws and practices that criminalize behavior by people living with HIV, noting that the most HIV criminalization laws were passed when there was very little information about transmission. And the CDC also noted that, and I'm quote, that HIV criminalization laws have not increased disclosure and may discourage testing, as I said, and not to mention stigma. Just the stigmatizing behavior itself and what it does for people from internalized stigma. So you are looking at it from 2 different angles, from the individual person and just stigma at large. So we're looking at, behaviors that should no manageable, treatable illness or condition, health condition should be criminalized. So this is just, I get all. So, it can prompt lawmakers to re-examine existing HIV criminalization laws just by reading this. Check your own state and see what's going on in your own state. See what's going on in your neighborhoods, and how people are really being impacted by this. And, this letter is also going to help serve as a catalyst, I believe, for community engagement. And I keep saying advocacy because a part of advocacy is teaching, is outreach, is education in a way that people can understand, and how it may not impact that person today. But again, this is a global issue. When I look at it from that perspective and how it affects people or can affect people from a public health standpoint. The detailed accounts of how this law is affecting individuals ties perfectly to this year's HIV is not a crime day theme. You care about HIV criminalization, but you just don't know it yet. And some people just don't know it yet. And, again, this is not just about one person being affected or impacted. I'm really excited to share that in Mississippi, we do have an HIV decriminalization bill that was dropped last week. Can I tell you how exciting this is? We've had it done in the past, and we have wonderful allies who have joined our efforts. And let me just say, 8 legislators, 8 signed on to this bill. And a lot of those representatives, and I was looking, and I'm still some on public health, some on Medicaid, but just from, and the committee is going to is Judd B, which of course is, does the criminal statute. But again, and I'll close by saying that this is a racial and social justice issue. And we have to look at the huge public health threat that this, I'm not going to say potentially has, but that it has, because it's still here. So thank you so much. I know we'll take questions later.
I just want to take a moment to stop and congratulate Mississippi and the work that y'all are doing. 8 sponsors is amazing. Oftentimes we as advocates have a hard time trying to secure one sponsor, and to have 8, I think it just speaks like the intersectional nature of your work and how y'all don't give up. So just want to stop there and take a moment to highlight and congratulate the work that y'all are doing.
Thank you. And I'm glad you mentioned the intersectionality of this work. We have explored a lot of different facets, and one in particular is mass incarceration and its intersectionality with HIV criminalization and what that really means. Who does it really impact? Has just been amazing. And our coalition, I must add, is a wonderful representation of communities in Mississippi. And I think that, because we're going to need everybody's support at our Capitol. So thank you for raising that.
Oh, you're welcome. I'm also very excited about heading just a little bit west into Oklahoma. So Nicole, my understanding is that Oklahoma actually has a pretty similar statute to the one in Tennessee around aggravated prostitution. If you could just talk about the decriminalization work happening in your state and what this findings letter could mean in your work.
Yeah, thank you, and thanks for having me. Thanks so much to everyone who shared so far. I know that on the ground in Oklahoma, it gives us a lot of hope to hear from other states and see where we hope our coalition building is going in the future as we think about our organizing work. So in Oklahoma, we know that like in the history of, as we've dug into this organizing, the first known diagnosed AIDS case was in 1983, and the first criminalization effort introduced in the state was in 1986. And so we saw a pretty immediate response to try and criminalize AIDS. And we've also seen sort of continued efforts in the state to disrupt updating our HIV/AIDS education in school spaces, including a 2019 effort that was passed by both chambers with Republican supermajorities and then was vetoed by our governor. So that is something we try to take into account with all of the layers around stigma and criminalization that exist in Oklahoma. And so when I joined the Freedom Oklahoma team and started digging into how we were going to do this work and how we were going to build coalition, part of that answer was in as many different ways as possible. The Oklahoma legislature is a tough place to work within. We are one of a handful of states that doesn't have any public testimony in our legislative process. So folks don't get to hear from the people that they are harming. We don't have expert witnesses except for in a very few special cases, mostly for Republican introduced bills. And so it means that we're having to do a lot of like one-on-one education with potentially like hostile folks who don't want to hear from advocates. It puts a lot more pressure on people who are engaging in this work. We have a health department that feels really afraid to talk about any legislation at all, which makes this a little bit harder. And so we started with a bill, and Representative Mauree Turner carried that first bill for us last year. And they have been such an incredible advocate in this work. And so much so that they helped us as we went into this legislative session ensure that we saw two bills introduced. So a House bill, again, by Representative Turner, as well as a Senate Bill 1418 from Senator Julia Kurt, who will be the next Senate minority leader in Oklahoma. And so was a big step forward in gaining some additional support and helping grow that support from the Senate side. And as we sort of continue this work to try to get these bills heard at the legislature, we know that we are working within a system where there's a lot of misinformation. Just sort of simultaneously, we are also seeing STI criminalization efforts be introduced and move. We are seeing some legislation moving this year that would gut a lot of our sex education. And I think of a question just last week where an author was asked what STI meant in his bill that sort of really limited what STI education could happen in schools, and he said he didn't know. And just to like, that's our starting point in a lot of places. And so Oklahoma has criminalization on the books in two areas. So the aggravated prostitution, as well as intention to spread. And we know that from the cases we've been able to follow in the news, that those are used within the context of Oklahoma's mass incarceration crisis, within the sort of lack of speedy trials, really long jail stays, to force folks into pleas, even in scenarios where there shouldn't be a conviction ever, and also that these shouldn't exist at all. And so for us, it has been using legislation as a platform to engage more folks in the conversation that this criminalization exists in Oklahoma, to build these coalitions and to think about sort of the intersections of this work. And just two more ways we are thinking about that. One is that it has been a space to talk about further criminalization opportunities and the importance of thinking about criminalization in the context of other public health work. And so there's an expedited partner therapy bill moving through the legislature this year, and is obviously best practice public health. And as we talked to those public health folks advocating for that, we said, and what about criminalization and how this could impact someone who like does not have that direct contact with a medical provider, to talk about the fact that they're at risk for criminalization, to talk about mitigation. And we had medical providers who said, well, they'll get a printout. And so it has been I think a moment to like dig in and figure out how we really talk about the intersections and like the needs to understand how criminalization impacts folks. And there's been follow-up conversations around that. And I hope that we can continue to like build out our coalition for folks to think about the implications of even best practice public health legislation, as long as criminalization exists on the books in Oklahoma. And we've also thought about it a lot in the context of Oklahoma's mass incarceration crisis. We are often up there in top rates of incarceration, with Mississippi and Louisiana, especially. In 2020, I, at the time, was at the ACLU of Oklahoma, and we were working on release of vulnerable populations around early COVID-19 crisis. And of the very small list DOC prepared of people who could be considered for medical parole, several of those folks were people living with HIV. And so I think that there is room to continue to think about like the disability justice lens and the mass incarceration crisis lens in this work in Oklahoma. And also in thinking from that space too. Representative Turner and I worked on an effort in the past as organizers around what became a mass commutation, but started out as some retroactive resentencing. And so the legislation in Oklahoma includes retroactive resentencing language in addition to the repeal, because it was really important for us that we both got this law off the books, and we talked about the importance of providing some sense of relief to people who've already been criminalized under this statute. And thanks to the fine folks at the Williams Institute, hopefully we will have some clear data on exactly how many impacted folks in Oklahoma that is, which was an effort in and of itself to obtain that initial information.
Oh, thank you so much for sharing, Nicole, like all of the work. And I just want to take a moment and also just say thank you as far as for being here. I just want to take a moment to acknowledge the recent killing of one of our youth. I don't want to like put too much or like put you on the spot, but just knowing all that your organization is doing right now in Oklahoma and across the country, taking the time to be here and just have a quick moment of silence as far as to not only honor Nex's life, but to honor trans and non-binary people who are still alive. as somebody who was an organizer prior to being an attorney, one of the favorite phrases I learned in organizing is you honor the dead and you fight like hell for the living. And I think that is a nice segue into our next question. So it's very exciting as far as the ADA being used in this way. And also, I'm thinking of a larger organizing and disability justice lens. What are some ways that this impacts this larger landscape? And this question is open to everybody, just thinking not just in terms of HIV advocacy, but how does this impact a much larger landscape? And anyone can just jump in.
I was going to say, I think as we've thought about this from some past organizing work in the criminal punishment system space, that it has allowed us to sort of reimagine different tactics that we can utilize to get folks free while we're working on long-term safety and repeal. And so is that looking at really targeted medical parole efforts that work for release? Is it working on a commutation project or something that works for freedom for folks currently incarcerated who are living with HIV while also working to repeal this on the books, and to lift up the realities of what it means to be a person living with HIV and to be criminalized for that and to exist within the really abysmal situation that is the Oklahoma carceral system. So I think for us, it's not only sort of this like litigation lens and the policy lens, but it's made us think about like what tactics we can imagine across issue areas and who else we can bring in this space to do some of that imagining and building work with us.
Should I jump in? Okay, thanks. Thanks, Nicole, for that. Yeah, and I sort of, my comment sort of echoes what you said, specifically in the litigation space, right? So as everyone here is well aware, the law is generally pretty slow to catch up with, well, just sort of reality generally, but certainly sort of scientific developments and how they change the landscape of these issues. And so I think what we've seen is that sort of challenges brought to these kinds of laws, to HIV criminalization laws, but also sex offender registry laws that sort of sweep in people who are prosecuted and convicted under these laws, have not fared particularly well. I mean, there are some limited exceptions, but courts have generally speaking viewed them with hostility and rejected them. And I think what is so important about the ADA and sort of introducing that lens into all our advocacy, both inside and outside the courts, is that I think the ADA looks at disability discrimination very broadly. It looks at it intersectionally, and it sort of sees and addresses the broad range of contexts in which disability discrimination manifests, right? So it looks at housing, it looks at employment, it looks at accesses to resources and services, basically all government sort of activities and programs. And so it takes this very broad view and it insists that a court's analysis be grounded in well-supported science, with particular deference to the sort of findings of bodies like the CDC, as was mentioned earlier. So I think that what is so exciting and promising here is that this tool, at least hopefully in the litigation space, will help focus courts on the relevant scientific evidence to think about and ultimately hopefully think about constitutional protections more robustly rather than sort of decision-making based on myth or prejudice or stigma or sort of just unsupported ideas about HIV and how it operates in the world.
Thank you for sharing that. Nicole and Alexi. I just think it's so important, like for us as advocates, to think not only of the work that we're doing, but the impact on sibling movements, especially thinking of the first webinar and Bianca, the historian and sexologist, who gave an amazing history of the Americans with a Disabilities Act and informed us of the many fights that people had to have and are still having to even be included in this act and to have the right to, fair housing and all of that. So just thank you for that. So before we move on, I just want to see if there are any more thoughts, sprinkles, comments, wonderings.
No, I definitely think that Nicole and Alexi definitely captured a lot of what I was going to say, just as far as like just really considering like all the people that need to be at the table and why is it so important to consider all our intersections or whatever as we go through this work. And so I think finding out seeing the letter and seeing how everybody has organized and all of the ways in which we've bonded together to make sure this work is continuously moving, I think is definitely things we need to really continue to be mindful of, because I know again we can get lost in our own work, but this for sure, especially for our coalition, has definitely informed our work even more.
So this is actually our last question, and then we're going to open it up to the Q&A, and then I'm going to go around and just ask anyone any last thoughts, or musings as far as to share with the group. So given the long-term nature of this work, and that's true everywhere, and that's especially true in the states that we've mentioned, where it's a lot of opposition to Black people, brown people, queer folks, trans folks, people living with HIV, and folks who are at all of those intersections. And that's our home. So given that it's long term, how do you stay whole and how do you stay engaged in this fight?
I can hop in. I think for me, one of the things that keeps me engaged, and informed or whatever is continuous learning. Because of course we always know that the landscape is going to change, but as long as we are abreast, and making other people aware of everything that's going on, I'm sure it has to continuously happen, because just as well as I may not know something today, there might be something that comes out tomorrow that if a person didn't know that, wouldn't even have found that out. So just continuously educating our communities, our peers, ourselves, in this work. Continue organizing, whether it's for larger organizations or smaller, or if it's just two people. I'm a firm believer, if one or two are gathered, you can make some stuff where, let me change my language. We can make some stuff work. There we go. Boom. And I also just kind of continuously remind myself of my why. And so for me, as a person living with HIV or whatever, like whatever these laws, it could be me. Like I said previously, I know friends personally who have been impacted by these laws. And so just continuous organizing, being reminded of the why. And lastly, for me, just continuously refueling myself and making sure that I recharge myself, because sometimes my batteries go down and I don't necessarily have all the fight for myself or whatever. So sometimes if it requires you to take just a brief second back, just continuously remind yourself of your why, recharge, and show up again. And so that's what sustains me: education, continuous organizing, and refueling myself.
Linda, please go ahead.
I'll go next. I remember the first call I received, it's been years, about HIV criminalization. I was blown away, quite frankly. I'm like, what? I mean, this is really happening. And when I started digging and I looked at the disproportionate impact it had in communities, I was quite frankly blown away. And I remind myself of that first phone call and the hopelessness that I felt and having to learn, see what was going on, be in community. So what I say is, what keeps me going is to keep showing up. Just keep showing up. DeMarcus said it, whether it's when one or two come together, keep showing up. And stay in community. Really talk to people. See what's going on in community, see how people are being impacted by this, and remain engaged, because sometimes I know it gets rough, and and sometimes the growth is incremental growth. It may not be as fast as we want it to be, but I think about the recalcitrant legislature here, and I'm a fighter, so I'm going to keep that moving. I think about Medicaid expansion, and we know what that looks like in southern states. Mississippi is one of those states that has not expanded Medicaid, and state leaders are adamantly opposed to it. So I think about that. I think about how people who are underserved, under-resourced, and what that looks like. So that all keeps me going, and just remaining committed to knowing that great is going to happen.
Oh, wow. Thank y'all so much. I'm encouraged. I wanted to see if Nicole and Alexi had anything that you wanted to add.
I think that this last week has been a real test for folks on the ground in Oklahoma, as we've dealt with this tragedy and seen our legislature sort of still continue to enact some really purposeful harm. To what DeMarcus said, I have found myself reading a lot more like queer movement history in the last few years, and thinking about like those lessons that I can learn from folks who've come before me. I also oftentimes find myself, when I am feeling sort of my most despair and struggling to like dig into hope as a discipline, that it is because I have spent like too many days in a row in the Capitol or in the legislature. And so it is a bit of like, how can I find space with community? How can I make sure that I am like talking and working with folks who are like dreaming and working towards liberation, and not just focus on the like spaces where it feels like we are running up against a wall and trying to disrupt harm. And that it's really helpful too to look at partners across the country doing this work and see those wins, especially in other states where folks often say it is impossible or they count us out. And to be connected to with all the people doing this work at a national level to try to dig into these places where it is hardest. And just a special shout out to Mike in particular with Equality Federation, who is someone who gives me just so much joy and hope on a regular basis. And like oftentimes is one of those folks when things feel bad, I know that I can look at anything that Mike is doing and I feel a little more hope for how we're going forward.
Thank you for shouting out the people, the partners that help make this possible. I think that y'all were very detailed and very thorough, and I'm not sure that we have any additional questions. So one of the things that I would like to do is end us early because it's a Tuesday evening, so why not? But I want to do a go around and just ask every person if there are any lingering thoughts, any closing thoughts to share with the group. It could be a question, a statement, anything. Linda, please start us.
Absolutely. I want to say to everyone on this call, panelists and guests, you are not alone. We are not alone. The vision and leadership demonstrated in this series that's been hosted by CHLP is nothing short of amazing and co-hosted, right? By other guests, has been nothing short of amazing, bringing everyone together. This is a movement, and I'm on fire just from this. I really am. We know tomorrow is a huge National Awareness Day. Is it the second or the third?
It's the third.
It's the third. That's amazing to have that as a National Awareness Day. And it's going to live forever because we're going to keep it going. But just to raise awareness of what's happening across the country and states that have had reform, we have people we can model from and best practices, and states that have it hard, we can commiserate and learn from each other and encourage each other. So I'm very inspired, and I'm grateful to be a part of this discussion tonight and to be a part of the movement overall. So I want to thank you all. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Alexi?
Sure. Well, picking up on a word that Linda just used, which is movement. And I think that is just so incredibly important because everyone here, everyone in attendance, everyone who's presented here is trying to come at this issue in a little bit of a different way, using all the tools that we have at our fingertips. But what I think is so wonderful and so necessary and so critical, and we have to sort of keep this as our touchstone, is that we are talking to each other. And we are integrating those strategies, and we are working in unison, and not letting ourselves be at cross purposes. I think that is so, so, so crucial in movement building and sort of tackling the task that is ahead of us. So, we need to do all the things. We need to organize our communities. We need to educate and lobby our legislators, no matter how hostile they may be. We need to bring legal challenges if and where that is appropriate, and if and where that is going to advance that organizing and sort of broader goals of the movement. We need to just bring individuals who are sort of being impacted by these laws out of isolation and into this conversation, and just do that as sort of deliberately as possible. And so that's what I'm hearing here. And that's, I think, again, thank you to CHLP for convening us, and Equality Federation for convening us, because it's a reminder that we are sort of working together towards something bigger, and it's just really an honor.
Thank you so much. Nicole? See you unmuted.
I was I think in the thinking about movement and tactics, that sometimes I have to remind myself that as much as I can get in the weeds about this policy we're fighting, or this effort in the context of the legislature, that at the end of the day, that this is liberation work. And when I think about sort of impossible work in Oklahoma, in 2019, I got to be part of the single largest day of commutations in US history, and 527 Oklahomans got free. And it was just a few months later that a similar space that I worked in, where we organized for a commutation, someone who had been in prison for 15 years for a really discriminatory failure to protect statute, got free and got to see her kids again. And it did not feel any different, whether it was 527 or one people, that with every person that we can get free, there is joy and purpose in that work. And so I think as I ground myself in continuing to fight in the policy spaces, sometimes zooming out and remembering that is so important.
I will
Thank
say, just really quickly, just honestly, just keep each other, keep yourself and keep your colleagues, your peers, everybody that you do this work with, keep them lifted because we know that this is a heavy load to carry sometimes, but as long as we all live together upward and onward, where we can make this move. And also just kind of mind yourselves, whatever, that you all are rewriting history, whether it's small and incremental steps or large steps. Celebrate the small wins. Always, I remind myself that all the time. Celebrate the small wins and always remind yourself that you are rewriting history.
Thank y'all so much. In true fashion, we do have a question. Stephen Williams, CHLP's own Stephen Williams, as Alexi pointed out, is that the courts tend to be hostile to the changes in the law that we seek. It seems that part of that is a resistance by the courts is often demonstrated by a refusal to accept the science that we speak of. The question is, how or what can we do to overcome this resistance to the facts as revealed by the science? I realize there's no one size fits all answer. It may be something to think about. Maybe start with you, Alexi, but it's open to others as well.
Sorry about that. Yeah, so I'll stick to the sort of litigation lane and sort of allow others working in different registers to speak to this. So I think this is exactly why the ADA as a tool is so important and promising here. Because, the ADA insists that a court, that policymakers make decisions that are well-based in science. That's actually written into the sort of regulations that implement the ADA, that governments may not act arbitrarily, they may not act and discriminate on the basis of disability based on superstition, based on supposition, based on sort of myth. But instead, that sort of rigorous scientific study must sort of drive these outcomes. Now, that's fairly unique. That's a little bit different than the standards that have been developed by courts around constitutional claims. And so it's really a great way to focus a court on that science and maybe bring courts and as a result, sort of decision makers, legislators up to speed with the science. I mean, I am sort of startled, perhaps naively, that people are just years and years and years behind in the sort of change that we've seen in the science around HIV. And so I see this as a really good vehicle. Some are decades behind, it's right, as a really important vehicle to force decision makers to reckon with that science. So, in the complaint that we filed in OutMemphis versus Lee, I mean, we have a captive audience. We filed a complaint. We included somewhere like 40 pages of scientific facts about HIV transmission, HIV treatment, to really sort of lay that point out and to make the case that these laws are irrational and completely outmoded. And so I think we all in our own sort of advocacy lanes figure out how to translate that science in a way that it can be heard and understood and taken seriously and wrestled with. And so I think, the whole theme of this panel, the sort of really sort of introduction of the ADA into this landscape is hopefully a sort of way in which we can do that.
Thank you. I'm curious if any of the advocates, like the folks who are, in the Capitol, a day in, day not, day in, day out, talking about the science, you know, if y'all have anything to add to Stephen's question. Nicole?
I will say that I think a thing that I have to remind people often with legislators, and I think it's important to remind them with folks in the courts too, is like at the end of the day, we're talking about people and people who come with their own sets of biases and lack of information. And so like when we first started having these conversations in the Capitol, like learned we had to start like way back from where we would like to be on a starting point. And that like we also had to talk to and have continued to have to talk to reporters more, that like there's not a lot of well-written stories around any of this work in Oklahoma because our very small journalism like landscape does not feel comfortable writing about this, or like feels uncomfortable with the facts, and so they don't dig into these stories anymore. And so similarly, we've tried to think about like all of the players in the criminal legal system where these cases are tried, the like work we still have to do around educating defense attorneys in the state and like making sure that they can talk about this work, the work to ideally like try to work with some prosecutors too, even though they're an especially tough bucket of folks in Oklahoma, but like to do that education, to try to get some of that education to judges. And we've looked at like bench cards as a starting point for some of that. And so I think that it's remembering that like, well, no one would ever suggest that you're trying to move a judge anyway from public opinion, that there has to be the organizing work to educate all of these decision makers and fill the gaps on that science.
And I'll just add that education is huge, especially as it pertains to the science. You have to kind of start there to build up. And, you know, in the past, I've done things like bring a clinician sometimes when I'm talking to legislators. I mean, I've done a roundtable where I've actually had an infectious disease doc there to talk about, you know, what this means and what it really looks like, to just really, you know, educate folks. And even when you have, you know, reputable information from an educational institution or CDC, you know, it's hard to move people when they are living in the past, or, you know, stigma is a barrier to even listening or having, you know, your mind changed about the science. So it's, you know, it can be difficult, but it's necessary.
I think that is a beautiful way to officially end. Um, as was said earlier, you know, February 28th, it's intentionally at the end of Black History Month, which I'm still upset is the shortest month of the year. Talk about institutional anti-Blackness. And it's, you know, at the start of March, you know, which is a Women's History Month, like literally thinking of the intersections. You know, it's the third annual HIV It's Not a Crime, you know, Awareness Day. And we're so happy to hold this event as a part of that call, to really amplify this issue as a form of state violence against our people. You know what I mean? And so it's my hope you check out other programming that's happening locally, also nationally, on Wednesday, in the daytime and in the evening. And because it's so many events, it's some happening on Thursday and Friday as well. And so I think that is the perfect place to close. I just want to say a huge thank you as far as the panelists. Y'all brought everything. Y'all really had the conversation that needed to be had. And thank you to all of the hands and minds who helped make this event possible. I love working with Equality Federation. I love working with the folks at CHLP who helped make it happen into each of your organizations. And so with that, I will say thank you, and I'll end with, we fight, we win. Let's keep fighting, y'all.